interested in Mercury in the 10th house, then I suggest we start by understanding Mercury and the 10th house. So let's start with the 10th house. Here it is. It's the open sky, and that's the basis of everything that it symbolizes in astrology. For example, it symbolizes visibility, and that's why it's the house of the extroverse and the extroversive. So it has to do with the public, with society, with the visible world, and with the visible gender, the masculine gender. It's a masculine house. This in turn is why it's the house for fame, which means how visible you are. So it will reveal a lot about our status, our notoriety, and our career, the way in which we are visible in the world. In turn, this also implies how much influence we have in the world. If you have fame and notoriety and status, then you have some amount of influence and authority. Another root thing about the 10th house itself being the open sky, it's a windy place. So a lot of its symbolism has to do with that. For example, it's the house of action. Things are moving here in the wind. It's literally a house for movement or travel. And this means it's opposed to being settled or rooted or stabilized. So it's fairly unstable or destabilizing, and it tends to disperse things. With this summary of the 10th house, we'll be able to interpret Mercury in it. But first, we need to brush up on what Mercury symbolizes. Mercury is basically the symbol for intellect. Intellect deals with codes and patterns. So, for example, it deals with communication because communication has to do with sending and receiving codes. And what are those codes? Languages, words, numbers, maths. Mercury has to do with interaction between people because that's the ramification of communication. So all forms of interaction, including the exchange of things and the exchange of goods or commerce and trade. Mercury symbolizes relationships because that's what happens when you interact with people. So especially partnerships and friendships. Mercury also has to do with recreation because that's the nature of friendship. It's recreational, so Mercury has a lot of recreational assets, like it's fun, it's witty, it's youthful. Mercury also symbolizes learning, of course, because that's intellect, right? What does learning really mean? It means the digestion of patterns, the recognition of patterns. So our ability to recognize things and understand new information. Mercury represents organization, because organization is nothing but keeping your patterns in order or keeping things in efficient patterns, so being neat. Mercury therefore has to do with symmetry because if you're organized and you keep your patterns in order, then they're probably symmetrical patterns, they're probably balanced. And thus Mercury has a lot to do with beauty because a lot of beauty is based on balance and symmetry. Finally, Mercury signifies our dexterity as a result of being very balanced. So it's in a position where it's able to really act efficiently and effectively and with expertise. Now, in order to understand Mercury in the 10th house, just take the symbolisms of Mercury and put them next to the symbolisms of the 10th house, and then just ask yourself, where do these things connect? And in what way do they connect, positively or negatively? For example, Mercury is communication, and the 10th house is extroversive. So there's a connection there between language and extroversion, communication and extroversion. That is an important clue, an important seed to understanding what Mercury represents in the 10th house. It has something to do with communication and extroversion. We'll explore that in a second, but let's look for some other clues first. For example, Mercury is all about interaction, and the 10th house is all about action. So this is another thing that we need to contemplate to be able to understand what Mercury in the 10th house really says. And the third thing is Mercury has to do with balance, but the 10th house has to do with instability. So maybe there's some kind of a clash going on here. So now that we've identified these clues or these seeds about what Mercury in the 10th house really says to us, let's talk to these seeds. Let's grow these seeds and see what they're actually saying. Let's start with Mercury being communicative and the 10th house being extroversive. What does that really mean? It means that Mercury in the 10th house is really good with communicating. But in what sort of way? It's the 10th house is extroversive and disclosing of information. So Mercury in the 10th house is very good at disclosing, exposing, divulging, displaying, and revealing. That's where its expertise in communication and interaction lies. Things which would be difficult for an ordinary person to express or show are easier for a person with Mercury in the 10th house to reveal and display. Now let's think about the second thing. Mercury has to do with interaction and the 10th house has to do with action. So this indicates effective interaction. Now that reinforces the ability to communicate well, because if you can communicate well, it means you interact effectively. So really, Mercury in the 10th house is expressive or disclosive, very effectively disclosive or revealing. Additionally, interact effectively also means they're expert. They have expertise in how they deal with things. They know how things work. So they have dexterity and expertise in their actions as well as in their words. So the first theme really is about how well Mercury in the 10th house discloses and reveals. The second theme is additionally about how much dexterity and expertise they have in their movements or actions or career. Then the third thing, which was maybe a clash, right? Mercury has to do with balance, but the 10th house has to do with instability. So what is this really saying about Mercury in the 10th house? Well, before we go too far with this, I'd like to remind you that Mercury has to do with balance, but this use of the word balance is not really synonymous with the word stability. Because Mercury is a very light planet. It's a very nimble planet. So Mercury's balance is not really achieved by its heaviness or its stability. It's achieved by its ability to go on both sides of the fence at the same time. So it's not really clashing with the instability of the 10th house. But we'll still find a trace of a clash here, to the effect that Mercury in the 10th house indicates a kind of tendency to extremism. Or what we can more generally say is that Mercury in the 10th house achieves balance by spreading itself out. So it may go extremely to one side of an issue to achieve balance on an issue that's imbalanced. Or it may explore very opposite ends of issues and therefore have extremity but achieving its balance through this diversion to the extremes. And so this ability to be spread out on different sides of an issue also aids in the basic nature of Mercury in the 10th house, which is to be communicative or revealing. So these are the ideas that I want to share with you about what Mercury in the 10th house is really saying to us. This is astrological theory. The way it goes into practice has to be modified based on the chart that you're dealing with, because there you'll find Mercury in the 10th house in all different kinds of contexts. So let's take a look at several charts now that have Mercury in the 10th house and talk about the kind of individual that actually had this chart. So who are these people that we could look at? Well, two very powerful speakers, Martin Luther King Jr. and Benito Mussolini. So let's look at those two charts. And then also we have three really significant authors or thinkers. Helen Keller, that would be a very interesting one. Prabhupada and Einstein. Then also let's look at three artists. Van Gogh, Raquel Welch, and Matahari, who is an artist/spy. But let's start with Martin Luther King. Why is he such a superb speaker? Of course, that's part of what's latent in Mercury in the 10th house, but not everybody with Mercury in the 10th house is going to be as great of an orator as Martin Luther King. So what is it about him? Well, first of all, in the first house, he has Jupiter. Jupiter is an oratory planet that influences the quality or the impressiveness of the voice. And Jupiter is in his first house in Taurus. So it's really becoming an attractive or compelling voice. In addition to that, his Mercury is his second lord, and the second house also directly influences how you speak. So if Mercury is in Aquarius in the 10th house, then it's the second lord in the 10th house. So in that case, the communication as an orator and speaker would really be highlighted. Furthermore, he has his first lord exalted in the 11th house. So it indicates that he has some finesse or taste. And also, since the first lord is exalted, it indicates that he has a lot of renown or he gets noticed. So if you combine having a lot of sense of taste with being able to communicate really well and having an appealing voice, then you can see the recipe is there for an amazing orator. Similarly with that, also in his 11th house is the third lord, which the third lord in the 11th house indicates eloquence. Let's take a look now at Benito Mussolini. Similarly, a very great orator, but very macho and violent. So like Martin Luther, he has something very significant going on with his Jupiter. His Jupiter is his second lord and is exalted in the 9th house. And on top of that, it's with Venus, who is the 7th lord, which aids in his ability to interact with others through speech. So there's the context of a chart that's already really stellarly disposed to being a very influential speaker. And in that context, he has Mercury in the 10th house. As for his other qualities, well, his Mercury is his 8th lord, and it's exactly conjoined the sun in the sun's sign. So there's a lot of macho-ness. Also, he's just a very 8th housey person in general and a kind of a malefic person in general. Because not only does he have a malefic sign ascending, but he's got his moon surrounded by malefics in the 8th house. And his first lord is also in the 8th house. Now, let's move on to the authors. Helen Keller, a great thinker, a great author, but also deaf and blind. So you'll notice her Mercury is barely in the 10th house. It's literally at 0 degrees of Leo, her 10th. So that is not only Bhava Sandhi, but that's Gandanta Sandhi. Bhava Sandhi means it's on the border of its place. It's on the border of its sign. And Gandanta Sandhi means it's on the border between water and fire, which is the most difficult of all the borders. So having Mercury Gandanta is an indicator for the potential of neural problems. She has debilitated Saturn in her 6th house with her second lord. So that really shows health problems. And then this Saturn here, debilitated in her 6th house, affects her hearing and her vision directly. For hearing, it affects the 3rd lord and the 3rd house very strongly. And for vision, it affects the 12th house and the 2nd lord very strongly. On top of that, her Sun and her Venus are very close to Ketu. Now let's have a look at Prabhupada. There you can see his Mercury in the 10th house. Why is he so religious? He's a religious author. Well, his Mercury is his 9th lord. And also the really striking thing about this particular chart is the 12th Lord Jupiter in the 8th house, exactly with Ketu. So that's a very spiritually intense signifier. Now, how about Einstein? Einstein is an extremely intelligent thinker and scientist, but also one of the most important things about him was his communication skills. So there's his Mercury in the 10th house explaining that he's able to disclose difficult information. And sure enough, his Mercury here is Vargotama, which makes it as if it was in its own sign. And then it's with Saturn. So Mercury plus Saturn, it's with Saturn very closely. Mercury plus Saturn is for science and logic. Furthermore, his real signature for intellect is the exaltation of his 5th Lord, which is also forming Raja Yoga via Parivartana with that debilitated Saturn, saving it from that debilitation by Nichapanga principle. Now let's move on to the artist. This is another sense of being able to express well and disclose well and reveal, communicate, to express yourself. Here's Vincent Van Gogh, one of the most famous artists. So his Mercury is his 3rd Lord. So that's giving skill, and it's also particularly giving manual talents. The real kicker in his chart, the real signature in his chart is his Venus. It's like incredible. His Venus is his 11th Lord, which is already kind of significant because Venus and the 11th house both have to do with artistic skill. Now, that Venus 11th Lord is exalted and Vargotama and in Raja Yoga because of his joining with Mars, which is the 5th and the 10th Lord. And furthermore, in its Vargotama placement in the Navamsha, it's in the 3rd house, the house of manual dexterity. So in this context, Mercury is giving this very ability to communicate well and reveal things. Really, his paintings are revealing the essence of what he sees in something. The color, it's not really accurate painting. It's very ideological and communicative and essential painting. Now, Raquel Welch, who's basically a sex symbol, really. Well, that's another implication of revealing what's usually hidden, showing things that are considered taboo. Her Mercury is her 10th Lord in the 10th house. So that's a strong indicator of personal fame, high visibility. Furthermore, it's exalted. Furthermore, it's in Raja Yoga because it's combining with the 9th Lord, the Sun. And furthermore, it is with both of the Trine Lords, the 5th Lord and the 9th Lord, and it's aspected by the other Trine Lord, the 1st Lord. So it's extremely blessed with prosperity, so that's why she's very beautiful, and it's extremely famous here in the 10th house. So it's actually giving her the ability to be disclosed and shown. Finally, this very interesting person, Matahari. She's also a sex symbol, but she's also a famous spy, so she's all involved in espionage. So in her case, Mercury is the 11th Lord, and it's with the 1st Lord in the 10th house. So like Raquel Welch, but to a smaller degree, it's showing personal disclosure, showing her own self, showing her own body, and personal fame and notoriety. But the espionage thing is really evident from looking at the nakshatras. Because there all of a sudden we see Mercury, Sun, and Mars, all three of them are in Ashlesha, which is the nakshatra for seduction and espionage. And on top of that, it's supported by her having a Scorpio ascendant. So now you can see how this basic nature of Mercury in the 10th house takes various forms and facets. Different facets of it become highlighted depending on the circumstances of that Mercury in the 10th house and the circumstances of the whole chart. So it's like a seed form of an interpretation that grows in different ways depending on what soil it's planted in. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.